the third part of the lecture on biological communities of vernal pools and indicator species. Um, Previously, we talked about the migratory breeders of vernal pools, and let's now talk about different types of migratory breeders. First, early migrants. Now, um, these animals migrate and lay eggs either in late winter or in early spring in the vernal pool environment. So this could happen as soon as ice or snow in the wetland starts to melt. Now, the disadvantage of being an early migrant or early migratory breeder in vernal pool environment is that there's only little food available because you're kind of rekindling that particular vernal pool ecosystem as soon as the ice is melting. But the advantage is there's only few species that can breed very early in the season. So therefore, you get only little competition, right? And also, there is very few or no predators because predators usually come later on as the season progresses. Another disadvantage or a rather better way to put it is another environmental constraint is um, particularly in the Northeast, in the late winter or in early spring, the temperature is still cold. During every night time, you may undergo nocturnal freezing, maybe continuously or maybe intermittently. So those are environmental constraints. The examples for these kind of early migrants, in terms of the amphibians, are going to be mole salamanders like the spotted salamander and the wood frogs. So these guys only undergo a single generation within a single season. For wood frogs, these generation cycles are quite short, like not more than a few months, a couple of months, but in terms of mole salamanders, it could be quite long. Um, it could be as long as starting from March all the way going up to August. Now, the second category, spring summer migrants. So, who performs migrations and breeding in vernal pool environments little later in the season. So, these guys are more adapted to breed in warm water, more adapted to develop in warmer water. So, because of its warmer water, kind of the development is faster. And because the water is relatively warmer and it's little late in the season, there's more food, natural resources available in the vernal pool by that time because the invertebrates may already have colonized and created the food base for amphibians in the vernal pool. Um, Examples are American toads, Fowler's toad, at least in northeastern United States, and great reef frogs are also a good example here. Um, Now these guys, lay eggs and immediately they hatch, um, and that hatching could be, triggered by water temperature, as well, or if the water temperature is still a little too cold, then the hatching could be delayed. Um, so these guys could actually complete multiple generations in the vernal pool, and also the diversity of spring summer migrants are quite high. The community of animals that are considered as spring summer migrants are quite high because there are more species that are adapted to breed in relatively warmer water conditions. And also it happens step by step. First species A comes in, then species B, then species C, like that. There is kind of a successional pattern of colonization of vernal pools by spring summer migrants as the season progresses. Now the third one will be fall migrants. So these guys lay eggs in the dry basin of the wetland, and the eggs are very desiccation resistant because imagine what I just mentioned. Okay, they lay eggs in the drier basin of the wetland when there is no water in the wetland, right? And so the eggs has to be resistant to desiccation. And what happens is, they remain dormant, in the dry basin, and immediately after flooding. It could be a fall rain, okay, or a fall snow melt. So after flooding, they could actually hatch and emerge as larvae. Or sometimes the hatching could be delayed until the spring season, right? So the hatching could be driven by temperature or photo period. The I will talk about examples next for each of these types. So here we are looking at toads, right? I mean, I mentioned two examples, fabulous toads and American toads. So in the middle image, let me take out my pointer again. See, in this middle two images, you are looking at the egg masses of toads, and you can see egg masses of toads are not actual masses; they are like strings. And over here, we are looking at the tadpole stages, and then the adult. So it would be kind of interesting to talk about the differences between the fowler's toad and the American toad. One, in American toads, in a large patch in the body, the dorsal side of the body, you find um, more than three warts inside a given patch, right? And if you look at the underside of fowler's toad, it's completely clear. There's no blotching or any kind of a dark spotty pattern. In the American toad, you get um, not more than one or two warts in each patch on its top of the body. And if you look at the underside of American toad, there's some sort of speckling pattern. Another feature in American toad, the parotid gland does not make contact with the cranial crest, which is a ridge you find immediately behind the eyeball. In Fowler's toad, in contrast, the parotid gland touches the cranial crest, or directly kind of in contact with the eyeball. Here we are looking at the great tree frog. Um, and you can see in one of the images you can see its gula sacs are pumping in and out. That's how they actually the males call. And another image you can see they are actually in amplexus. Now all the toads and great tree frogs are explosive breeders as well, and their calls are extremely high in intensity. It's deafeningly high during their breeding season. Not every vernal pool migrant species breed in the vernal pool. There are several non-breeding migrants. In the image I'm looking at, we are looking at the northern water snake. Let me take my pointer again. This is northern water snakes, and here Amanda is holding the northern water snake, and then common garter snake, painted turtle, and a common snapper. So, in fact, now there's more evidence coming up uh, to suggest that turtles and both snakes and turtles occupy or associate vernal pools during at least a particular part of the season for foraging purposes. Um, so it's kind of an interesting finding. It has not been historically considered, but there are a lot of evidence coming from the recent literature, including my own research. So we talked about migrants, and now let's talk about a little bit about our permanent residents. Now, in Professor Cordillero's lecture, he talked extensively about these guys. So permanent residents of vernal pools are overwhelmingly invertebrates. Okay, so these guys don't leave the pool basin or the pool vicinity, for the most of the time. In other words, they stick in and around the vernal pool environment throughout their life cycle. Um, so these guys, are largely going to be either insects or arachnids or crustaceans. So when it comes to insects, their adult stages are airborne, flying, winged insects. Still, despite even though they have wings, they don't fly quite further away from the wetland immediate riparian environment. They just kind of hang around. And the larval stages of these guys are spent as eggs or larvae in the vernal pool basin. So like I mentioned, even the adults do not actively disperse over a long distance. The eggs or pupal stages are capable of estivating and thereby avoiding the drier conditions in the vernal pool basin, outside the growing season. And they become active. They drop their dormancy and become active during spring or summer, based on the timing of flooding. Um, and in certain occasions, sometimes, in a few occasions, there has been record where they becoming active during early winter or during fall, provided that the pool floods. Kind of indicating that presence of standing water in the vernal pool kind of triggers the activity. And when the vernal pool dries down, they reproduce, produce cysts, eggs, and become dormant. So, for your examples over here that you may already have learned, um, from Professor Cordio's lecture over here. They're looking at tube effect worms. Spiders. Now, there's very little studied about the spiders of vernal pool environments. Now, these guys are hunters. They are perfectly capable of diving and kind of, using the surface tension of water to walk on the top of the water film. Um, so, what they do when the pool dries down is something we don't know. And over here we are looking at a parrot shrimp, crustaceans. Here we are looking at a daphne and tadpole shrimps. So let's talk a little bit about vernal pool amphibians. So most of these vernal pool amphibians, not all, most of these vernal pool amphibians are non-overwintering migratory breeders. So meaning they actually don't overwinter in the vernal pool environment, right? So they could be, again, let me emphasize that adult amphibians do not most often overwinter in the vernal pool basin or in the dry or in the uplands. So that's what I meant by non-overwintering. Now these guys, early either could be breeding in migrating and breeding in early spring, late spring, early summer, and sometimes in fall. Um, So what happens here is adults are terrestrial. So adults during the mating season they copulate in water. Okay. So they in terms of endurance they undergo amplexus. Salamanders have other forms of interesting courtship behavior, and so in terms of frogs, females or frogs and toads, females releases eggs first, and the male fertilizes them by releasing sperms. Though the fertilization is external in the amphibians, in neurons, but when it comes to salamanders, the males drop the spermatophore and the female picks it up. So the fertilization in salamanders happen inside the female's reproductive system. So hence internal fertilization. So eggs in both cases, amphibians, all the form of amphibians, both salamanders and anurans, eggs are produced or laid in water. Larvae develop in water, and when they metamorph, they become terrestrial. Um, so for both species, like for many species of pond breeding amphibians, including salamanders and frogs and toads, breeding happens relatively early in the growing season. Um, And the development for all of those pond breeding amphibians is indirect, meaning there is embryonic development happening inside the egg and subsequently larval development happening as a larvae outside the egg. The hatching success for many pond breeding amphibians is very high, but larval mortality is very high as well. So almost all of the eggs, more than 90%, more than 95% of the eggs can hatch and produce larvae, but not all that larvae are gonna survive and metamorph, right? And in certain cases, even without any direct human influence, could be by natural drought, or could be by some other natural means, 100% of the larvae in a given vernal pool can die. So, whoever the larvae individuals that gets to survive um, their larval stage, they undergo metamorphosis, and they leave the wetland, they leave the pond and move to other habitats. It could be uplands, it could be another wetland like a marshland or a river, and in other environments they undergo years of growth, and after years of growth they uh, reach sexual maturity. Now, how long do they grow? That depends on the species as well as the latitude as well as the different environments they associate. So after they reach sexual maturity, the adults migrate back to their natal farms for breeding. So these adults tends to have very high breeding site fidelity. Some of the vernal pool amphibians are explosive breeders, meaning reproduction of certain vernal pool breeding amphibians are limited to a very shorter period of time, and these adults visit their vernal pools in extremely large numbers in such a shorter period of time, and where all of them breeds at the same time. Okay, the examples are wood frogs and chorus frogs, and I earlier mentioned great tree frogs and toads can also be considered as explosive breeders. Then, on the other hand, we have broadcast breeders. These guys reproduce over a longer period of time in the season, um, but at a given time during the season, only a few number of individuals of a given species aggregate in the vernal pool for breeding activities. So the example is green frog. Pickerel frog can also be an example over here. Um, so wetlands with a shorter hydro period or vernal pools with a relatively shorter hydro period um, may influence or may lead to the evolution of early metamorphosis of smaller sized young, because larval period is shorter, because of the hydro period is shorter, and because of that the larvae does not get enough time to assimilate energy and build up body mass. So when they metamorph, they tend to metamorph as a smaller body size, and you can understand that the smaller body size have a lower survival. So that's one life history strategy. The other aspect is, in vernal pools with a relatively longer hydro period, you tend to have a prolonged larval development, a longer time for the larvae to develop, assimilate energy, put up body weight, put up body mass, and then they metamorph at relatively larger body size. So those large sized adults or young that emerge from the wetland may confer greater survival. Um, Some vernal pool amphibians, for example wood frogs, can breed every season after they reach sexual maturity. Spring creepers, chorus frogs, all of those belongs to that particular category. Those repeated breeders breed in masses, like meaning the large number of individuals revisit the wetland in every season, and they could produce a huge number of hundreds or sometimes even thousands of egg masses in a given wetland. Um, on the other hand, more salamanders or ambistomerids, they live for a relatively longer time, and many ambistomerids are known to live for between 20 to 30 years, and they may completely forego breeding in consecutive years, right? So again, going back to the previous example, the repeated breeders, those guys like wood frogs or chorus frogs or spring peepers, these adults after sexual maturity, they may not live more than 10 years, and sometimes it's actually around 5 years, certain cases between 5 to 8 years, but never do they survive beyond 10 years after sexual maturity. So kind of makes sense. Those repeated breeders have short lifespans as sexually mature adults, so they breed every season to enhance their reproductive success, whereas in more salamanders who have a greater lifespan uh, in terms of decades, and they breed intermittently. So in between successive reproduction efforts, they actually put up more energy that can be kind of translated into production of eggs. So in this slide, you are looking at many species of chorus frogs. Now, in the Northeast, we don't have many chorus frogs. Well, in Massachusetts, we don't have any chorus frogs. If you look into the entire Northeast, we do get chorus frogs. In New Jersey, there is upland chorus frog, and there's New Jersey chorus frog, in New Jersey, and then we have several chorus frogs in Maryland. So distribution of chorus frogs in glaciated Northeast is quite limited. in fact limited to the southernmost boundary of the state. Um, and what you see in the image, in the photographs, actually the chorus frogs occurring outside Massachusetts. So here we are looking at the upland chorus frog, southern chorus frog, boreal chorus frog. Now this is a very interesting species because it has a very broad distribution. By the name boreal, it indicates that it occurs in the boreal region. And do they only occur in the boreal region? No, you find them even in southwestern states, right? And then we have the Spreckless chorus frog, and this pretty looking one is called the ornate chorus frog. So chorus frogs are largely found within the southeast. For example, the southern chorus frog is found in the southeastern part. Um, Upland chorus frogs are also found in the southeastern United States, and they also occur in the mid south, in the southern Mississippi River Basin, as well as in the southwest. And a few of them occurs or spreads all the way to Canada. So they have a very broad distribution, but interesting enough, they are not that common in the Northeast or in the New England for that matter. So now what we are going to do is we will go through multiple different species that inhabit vernal pools, but within amphibians, different species that use vernal pools for a variety of functions, mostly for breeding. Um, So first, wood frogs. They are vernal pool indicator species. Okay, they are primary indicators of vernal pools, right? Meaning their reproductive fitness is best conferred by breeding in vernal pool. Um, their distribution is quite wide. In fact, it's among one of the most widely distributed species, both latitudinally and longitudinally. If you look at the map, you see across latitudes, their distribution ranges from as south as um, southern Georgia, right, and all the way up to Canada, okay, and longitudinally from the westernmost edge of Alaska to the easternmost part of New England and Canada, right? So quite broadly distributed species. And of course, in the map you see there are several patches, isolated patches that you find in southeastern US as well as in certain parts of the Great Plains. But aside from those patchy distributions, you see a very continuous broad distribution throughout the North America. And so you can also see that given their distribution in Canada, actually kind of spreading throughout Canada, um, their distribution almost reaches the Arctic Circle. Um, in eastern Mass and western Rhode Island, these species were recorded in extremely high abundance, right? In fact, throughout their distribution, especially in the northeastern US, they can be considered as the most abundant vernal pool breeding amphibians. Um, they have found if a survey done in eastern Massachusetts and western Rhode Island, the point I was trying to make previously, um, research team found evidence for evidence for wood frog breeding about 72 to 77% of the vernal pools is surveyed. So that's actually a very high very high efforts on reproduction. And these are early breeders. We mentioned that before. They could start breeding when snow is still on the ground and when ice is just melting. Within its geographic distribution, breeding activities can start as early as January in its southern latitudes and as late as July in its northern latitudes. Um, in either way, July is early in the growing season for northern latitudes, and January is early for southern latitudes in terms of the growing season. Now, genetic distance-wise, the amphibians that emerge from closer by wetlands are genetically relatively distant compared to amphibians from distant pools. So this is actually a really interesting finding, meaning their metapopulation dynamics in wood frogs occurs across the landscape, not just within the immediate neighborhood. Um, so during the breeding season, adult males and females may remain in the vicinity of the wetland for about 1 to 2 years. Oh, sorry, not 1 to 2 years. What am I talking about? For 1 to 2 weeks. Um, in terms of the reproductive success, females produce about 200 to nearly 900 eggs per egg mass. Okay, most females only produce one or a fewer number of egg masses. But if you capture a reproductively mature wood frog female, remove the ovaries, and look into the number of ova they find, you find a lot more ova, about 1 to 3,000 ova, right, per female. But when they produce eggs, they don't produce that many eggs. It's we don't know why. There's a huge differences between number of ova produced and the number of eggs actually laid. And also these guys are the communal clutches. They make communal clutches, meaning females release egg masses in the same location of the vernal pool. Well, in a given vernal pool, of course, there's a good chance you find non-communal egg masses, but females, or rather the egg larvae that is hatching out of communal egg masses develop faster. The reason is in communal egg masses, the temperature is relatively higher because those multiple masses of eggs preserves heat, and that hastens the larval development as well as the embryonic development. Um, so the eggs are usually laid right at the edge of the water surface, around submerged vegetation, and also in hot spots in the vernal pool, right? So the location where they lay eggs in a given vernal pool could also be the same within between among subsequent breeding seasons. And tadpoles that emerge from these egg masses are omnivorous, and they could feed on other eggs, particularly the mid-seasonal or late-season breeders. And they can also feed on at older tadpoles can also feed on tadpoles of other species. Um, these guys have a very high hatching success, but very low larval survival. Their development is extremely fast. Okay, they could emerge in late spring, right? And that is emergent before the actual summer, right? And reach the sexual maturity within 2 to 3 years. On average, there could be extreme cases where the things goes kind of backs out of the norm, but lifespan after the sexual maturity could be about 3 to 5 years. Um, in throughout its distribution, not just in the Northeast, throughout the distribution range of wood frogs, they could undergo extreme fluctuations in the population recruitments. Continuing on about more about wood frogs. I mentioned that most wood frogs do not remain around the vicinity of the vernal pool and overwinter. But there are certain populations throughout its distribution, certain populations are known to overwinter under the leaf litter or in shallow burrows around the immediate vicinity of the breeding wetlands. So here, males during late fall, they move towards their natal ponds, and they then overwinter by hibernating in the leaf litter or in burrows, and this could be a kind of an adaptive response with an evolutionary advantage, because if you access the vernal pool as early as possible, in which case it does, right? Because when you wake up in the spring, you're right at the vernal pool. There is no need for migration, so you kind of get to lay eggs early in the vernal pool, providing a greater time frame for the larvae to develop, even in wetlands with a relatively shorter hydro period. Um, and what triggers these adults who overwinter in the vernal pool vicinity to wake up? Well, the warmer temperatures and melting snow, but not the timing. It's not how long has it passed, it's basically driven by temperature, which is also an evolutionary advantage. Particularly in case if you get a late winter, they are not waking up by the time they actually wait until actually snow starts to melt. Actually, until the temperature goes above zero, even slightly above zero is good enough for them. So how do they survive the frigid winter within leaf litters or shallow burrows? Well, they have a cryoprotectant. Now, what kind of a cryoprotectant are we talking about? Look at the graph on the top right. Um, so in that graph, you can see that in the field conditions as well as in the lab conditions, there are skeletal muscles and the heart muscles convert glycogen into glucose. The same happens in the liver, right? And there's a lot more glucose production happening in the liver than in the heart, and leg muscles produce little less um, glucose than the heart muscles. And you can also see in that figure that the field frogs released a lot more glucose than the lab animals. Um, so what does this glucose do? Glucose is released from these organs, from these muscles, into the bloodstream, and in the bloodstream, it actually acts like an antifreeze. So that antifreeze actually keeps the blood circulation going on throughout the winter, supplying blood to the vital body tissues, and all the non-vital tissues and the cells actually shuts down. And you can see in the bottom figure, in the burrow, so under the leaf litter, in the shallow leaf litter and shallow soil layers, the temperature is relatively stable. Below zero for sure, but relatively stable. So their overwintering habitat kind of provides a relatively thermally stable environment. But do not forget that environment they hibernate in, they overwinter in, um, does undergo below freezing. Continuing on our conversation about wood frogs, the adult wood frogs occupy a wide variety of terrestrial, aquatic, and other wetland habitats. These habitat preferences are known to vary across different geographies as well as within a particular geography across seasons. So, new metamorphs tends to remain closer to the vernal pool environment or within the vernal pool for a few weeks before they actually start their journey away from the vernal pool. So the dispersal of these metamorphs could be triggered by the relative humidity as well as by the pond drying. And when they disperse, they tend to disperse about 400 to 800 meters away from their from the from the pond in which they were born. Um, the home range of these species are relatively small but kind of large compared to its body size, about between 45 to 65 square meters. Um, Now, I think we mentioned on several occasions that the wood frogs adults tend to return to their natal pool over and over and over across years to their natal pool for breeding in subsequent years. So very high pond fidelity for breeding activities. So this happens in a given population. About 90% or maybe more than 90% of the individuals of that population actually visit their natal pond for breeding in subsequent years. But um, something around 5 to 10% of that population will not come back to the natal pond. They will disperse elsewhere into different vernal pools for breeding when they are ready to breed. And those um, those wood frogs that go in search of non-natal ponds may actually migrate over 1,000 meters. That is actually nearly more than a kilometer in search of other vernal pools for breeding activities. And in that case, they search for well shaded, with a vernal pools with a thick, dense canopy cover. Um, they can tolerate low pH, so they are somewhat tolerant of acidity. Um, and there has been a lot of studies that investigating um, the relationship between number of egg masses and the pool size, number of egg masses and the hydro period. Now, the results are quite variable, but in general, they are known to breed in even very smaller vernal pools with a very shorter hydro period. But defining a clear relationship for these variables is quite difficult and it's highly variable, in other words. Um, Females has a great role in the site selection because if females tend to disperse to non-natal vernal pools, then actually that kind of dispersal into non-natal vernal pools actually drives the population dynamics and gene flow of that particular population. This is the fourth part on the lecture about biological communities and indicator species of vernal pools. Continuing on our conversation about wood frogs, the adult wood frogs occupy a wide variety of terrestrial, aquatic, and other wetland habitats. These habitat preferences are known to vary across different geographies as well as within a particular geography across seasons. So, new metamorphs tends to remain closer to the vernal pool environment or within the vernal pool for a few weeks before they actually start their journey away from the vernal pool. So the dispersal of these metamorphs could be triggered by the relative humidity as well as by the pond drying. And when they tend to disperse about 400 to 800 meters away from the from the pond in which they were born. Um, the home range of these species are relatively small but kind of large compared to its body size, about between 45 to 65 square meters. Um, Now, I think we mentioned on several occasions that the wood frogs adults tend to return to their natal pool over and over and over across years to their natal pool for breeding in subsequent years. So very high pond fidelity for breeding activities. So this happens in a given population. About 90% or maybe more than 90% of the individuals of that population actually visit their natal pond for breeding in subsequent years. But um, something around 5 to 10% of that population will not come back to the natal pond. They will disperse elsewhere into different vernal pools for breeding when they are ready to breed. And those um, those wood frogs that go in search of non-natal ponds may actually migrate over 1,000 meters. That is actually nearly more than a kilometer um, in search of other vernal pools for breeding activities. And in that case, they search for well shaded, with a vernal pools with a thick, dense canopy cover. Um, they can tolerate low pH, so they are somewhat tolerant of acidity. Um, and there has been a lot of studies that investigating the relationship between number of egg masses and the pool size, number of egg masses and the hydro period. Now the results are quite variable, but in general they are known to breed in even very smaller vernal pools with a very shorter hydro period. But defining a clear relationship for these variables is quite difficult and it's highly variable, in other words. Um, Females has a great role in the site selection because if females tend to disperse to non-natal vernal pools, then actually that kind of dispersal into non-natal vernal pools actually drives the population dynamics and gene flow of that particular population. We are moving on to a new species, green frogs. Green frogs usually breed and occupies permanent or semi-permanent water bodies. Adults as well as larvae are highly aquatic. Um, they do breed in vernal pools, but not primary indicators of vernal pools. They are facultative occupants of vernal pools, and they choose vernal pools for breeding and occupancy, particularly only during um, relatively wet years. Um, so their development lasts for more than a year I'm talking about larval development, which lasts for more than a year. Um, so the tadpoles needs to overwinter. So they are actually well adapted to overwinter, either in frozen ponds or in dry ponds in the mud. So generally, these guys breed late in the season, so they are late breeders and broadcast breeders, meaning fewer individuals reproduce at a time over a longer period of time. Um, they can, they are capable of performing very wide dispersions upon hatching and upon metamorphosis. Um, it could be as much as 5 kilometers away from their natal wetland. Now adults, similar to the dispersion of the metamorphs, adults tend to have a extremely variable home range, meaning these critters move around a lot, from wetland to wetland, from from marsh to a stream, from a stream to another wetland, from that wetland to a vernal pool, like that. They tend to associate, multiple habitat, thus have a very extremely variable home range. For the breeding season, they tend to migrate about 300 meters into wetlands. In certain areas, they have documented about two different breeding periods. One breeding period is the most known one, April-June season, at least for the Northeast. And in certain populations, they could breed in the late summer or in fall. And during the breeding season, males establish territories and they could defend their territory by vocalizations, by posturing themselves in very specific way, or even going into physical combat with rival males. And on the top image, you can see their distribution. So that actually goes nearly throughout um, the eastern US, including the Great Lake areas as well as parts of the central South. So that is an egg mass of green frog, and they actually lay eggs not in a very a visible mass. It's kind of camouflaged within aquatic vegetation, so kind of hard to detect the egg masses unless you are looking very well. And those develop into larvae, and remember, who can overwinter. And then they develop the adult space, right? And kind of a characteristic feature of these guys are this huge tympanum and that little the central dot that you find within the tympanum, and voracious predators, by the way, of insects. And the adults are, like I mentioned, could be largely aquatic but also well capable of dispersing over the land. Very hardy species. Now we are going to talk about northern leopard frog. Again, this is not a vernal pool indicator species. Okay, um, I wouldn't even recommend considering it as a vernal pool secondary indicator because it can occupy many other non-vernal pool habitats. Now, don't get me wrong. Can you find them in vernal pools if the hydro period is longer? In especially wet year, you could, but it would not be a wise idea to consider them even as a secondary indicator species. So the adults are usually found in open habitats like grasslands, scrublands, sparse woodlands, floodplains, where the vegetation, where the hardwood vegetation cover is very low, pastures, wet meadows, mesic prairies, you name it. Um, the breeding habitats includes, again, a diverse type of more or less permanent water bodies, slow moving, sluggish rivers, um, and different types of wetlands, mostly permanent wetlands, beaver ponds, human constructed habitats. So they are also very non-selective for breeding sites. Um, the ponds they select for breeding mostly tends to be open canopy, and they are also well known for to perform a variety of dispersions and migrations. So during spring, adults migrate from their hibernacula to their breeding pond, and then the metamorphs who's coming out, emerging out of the pond, could migrate from the natal pond to or natal wetland to a new habitat. And then during summer, adults or metamorphs will migrate from their summer habitats to hibernacula to for overwintering purposes. And then tadpoles too can disperse passively through intermittent waterways that actually emerge during flooding or during rainy seasons. So in the top map, you will notice that northern leopard frogs too has a very wide distribution. In the western part, you notice that they actually range across latitudes as well as longitude from west to east, right? But the interesting story is they are not common throughout that particular range. Their distribution is quite patchy. And in fact, in the Northeast, there are a lot of evidences for population decline of these species. They're quite sensitive to development, fragmentation, and agriculture. Now to the American bullfrog. Now, these guys are largely aquatic. One of the most aquatic anurans that I'll be talking to you about. They are rarely found far away from water. They breed almost exclusively in permanent water bodies. Um, their breeding period is quite extensive. They could start breeding at least in the northeast as early as May, and the breeding could continue as far as September. Younger females who are quite close to their reproductive, who just reach their sexual maturity, will only produce a single clutch. But as they age, they will increase in their body mass, put more fat into that, and produce a large number of clutches in a given season. The larval development could take multiple years. I'm talking about more than 2 years, meaning they may need to overwinter more than once during their life cycle before they emerge as adults. Very high in terms of the reproductive potential, about 20,000 eggs in a given clutch. Males are extremely territorial and they are also polygynous, meaning a single male could mate with multiple females in a given season. Um, in terms of territoriality, bullfrogs can recognize neighboring males versus invading males that are actually new to the pond. How they respond to neighbors versus strangers is quite different. These territorial um, defenses could escalate into fights, which could include wrestling, pounding, and shoving against each other. Um, During the breeding season, there could be certain evidences of parasitism type of breeding, meaning certain males um, could actually kind of interfere with other calling males and try to mate with female amphibians that were not necessarily attracted to them. Opportunism, meaning certain less fit males would actually attempt to fertilize another female's eggs without her knowledge. And where do they breed? Well, they're known to be very adaptive to and to breed in human made habitats like farm ponds, backyard ponds, golf course ponds. um, and also, if you look at the top image, that's it, that the overall distribution range, and there's current evidence that suggests that their western populations are non-native and eastern populations are native. And either way, they have an extremely wide distribution range within North America. So, bullfrogs. So here, over here, on the, let me get my pointer. Best way to show that. This is a bullfrog egg mass. So it's kind of a, doesn't have a particular shape. It's kind of a amorphous mass laid. It is first laid on the surface, after fertilization. Immediately after, it actually sinks to the bottom, but the development doesn't stop. And then, of course, these are the larvae. And this picture doesn't justify it. These larvae could be extremely big, particularly since they actually overwinter multiple seasons and remain as a larvae for a longer period of time. And that's why they require permanent water bodies, because they require to keep growing as much as possible during the growth season. So vernal pools are not the best for these guys. So you may see an adult bullfrog in a vernal pool. That is to feed on something else. That's to cool down, but not for breeding activities. And then on the lower two panels of the images, you are looking at two adult bullfrogs. And what I want to tell you is, they actually have not only that the fact that they are ginormous, but also the fact that they may have different body coloration patterns and morphologies. Um, Now over here you are looking at a bullfrog, trying to catch a flying insect with its tongue. So these guys can leap really high up horizontally as well as vertically, right? Voracious predators, extremely efficient predators. And on this image, you are looking at a bullfrog feeding on a fish. So meaning that they are actually predators. They are generalist voracious predators. And in that image, you are looking at a bullfrog feeding on a cricket frog. So they can eat tadpoles, eggs of other frogs, and adults of other frogs. Over here, a bullfrog is feeding on a ribbon snake. So those are extremely voracious predators. And imagine their impact in the Western North America as an invasive species. There's a lot of studies done on that. You may want to look up on them. Now we are looking at Pseudacris crucifer, spring peeper, okay, the harbinger of spring. And these guys breed, these are early breeders. They breed immediately after wood frogs. Now, are they vernal pool indicator species? No. Do they breed in vernal pools? Yes. So where do they usually breed? They can breed in any type of a temporary flooded wetland. They are extremely small species, probably among the smallest inurans in North America. Um, and they call around in wetlands. They don't call from the water necessarily. Most of them call from the vegetation that is kind of emergent from the wetland or kind of branching into the wetland. Um, Largely distributed in eastern North America as well as parts of the Central America, including the Great Lake area, and some of them disperse all the way up to southern part of Canada. Now we are looking at the great tree frog, right? And there are two species. One is eastern great tree frog. That's a type of the species you find in Massachusetts, and the other one is Cope's great tree frog. So let me take my point out to show which one is which. This is eastern gray tree frog. The one on the bottom is Cope's gray tree frog. Now, the eastern gray tree frog is quadruploidic, meaning they have four sets of chromosomes, right? And Cope's gray tree frog, like us, are diploid. Okay? They only have two sets of chromosomes. So the eastern gray tree frog, its distribution is more northern within the eastern North America. Coast tree frogs distribution is relatively southern within the eastern part of the North America. Um, and okay, how do I know which one is which? Well, what kind of morphological characteristics can you use to differentiate those two tree frogs? Well, the answer is there's none. Okay, they are identical in terms of their morphology, they are identical in terms of their habitat selection, breeding activities, breeding season, development, and all of that. Only difference is their calling pattern. That's very interesting. So if you look at the link I provided to you, if you click it, you will it'll take you to a website in which you can play and see how different their calls are. Calls are extremely different, but morphologically quite similar. And one more thing about their larval stages. So that the larval tail most often have this bright red color pattern. Kind of quite interesting. We don't know why it is there, but it is there. So right now over here, you are looking into the two types of distribution of those two species. Um, Cope's gray occurring relatively in the northern part of eastern North America, and the eastern gray occurring relatively in the northern part of eastern North America. But now, if you look at the maps and compare them closely, you will realize that there in certain areas their ranges do overlap. Now I'm going to talk about the ecology of both great tree frogs, eastern gray and Corpse gray at the same time. So they breed relatively late in the season, relative when there is continuous warmer weather without any freezing going on. So in the northeast, it's May onward. Now, in certain populations, they could be explosive breeders where a large number of individuals in a given population breeds at the same time, right? But that breeding season could vary from May, from as early as May to as late as August, September. Because in my field experience, I've heard them calling as late as September. But when they breed explosively, but may not be in the exactly the same time frame throughout its geographical range. Now these guys too produce glycerol as an antifreeze, so hence they are very successful in overwintering. Um, they do also show pool fidelity in successive years, where they keep returning to their natal pond. Now, are these guys indicator species of vernal pools? Well, not primary indicators. Do they breed in vernal pools? Yes, we have recorded that, but they are not considered primary indicators of vernal pools. Not unreasonable to consider as secondary indicator species or facultative indicator species. Um, and also, some individuals, both males and females, could actually mate and reproduce in multiple ponds in a given season. Um, they actually tend to avoid ponds or wetlands with snails for breeding activities. The reason is certain snails tend to carry an intermediate stage of a particular trematode parasite that can infect frogs. So that they may have developed some sort of a environmental sensing mechanism where um, individuals may not attempt to breed or mate in a wetland that has a significant population of these snails that are an intermediate host to this trematode parasite. Kind of a characteristic feature in these guys is that they have this, bright reddish orange patch in the underside of the thigh of these tree frogs. um, and these digits of these tree frogs have an enlarged toe pad. With these toe pads, they can actually kind of climb vertical surfaces. I mean, they are tree frogs, so that's an adaptation they show for arboreal mode of life. They can hibernate within arboreal habitat in bark crevices, in tree hollows. And as you can see in the bottom image, they are very good at camouflaging in the on the bark because their body coloration kind of mimics the lichen patterns on tree trunks. Their habitats includes moist woodlands, forests, mesic forests, as long as there is sufficient access to freshwater ponds, puddles, bogs, swamps, and other type of wetlands for breeding activities. Again, I won't emphasize that these guys do breed outside vernal pools, so they are not. That's why they are not a primary indicator of vernal pools. Well, now we are shifting to salamanders, pond breeding salamanders, and the first example that you see over here is the spotted salamander. And all of these pond breeding salamanders belongs to the family Ambystomatidae. Um, on the top image, you are looking at the larval stage, which is 100% aquatic. They grow up, develop, until metamorphosis in vernal pools, and the guy on the bottom is the adult, which you might find in vernal pools during the breeding season, but for the rest of the time it spends its time underground on or in the forest. So the adults are hard to find, not because they are rare, but because they are quite not detectable. You look at the map, the distribution is nearly all over the eastern North America, including parts of the Midwest, the Mid South, and the Great Lake areas. Very widely distributed, quite a wide latitudinal distribution, ranging from the southernmost parts of southeastern US, excluding Florida, and extending all the way up to Canada. That is spotted salamander egg masses. And remember, they have this double coating around their eggs. Now, that is two is spotted salamander egg mass. So, one on the left is more transparent. The coating or the gelatinous covering is more transparent. The other one, it is very translucent. Now that's two, and spotted salamander egg mass that's kind of lifted off the of water. The consistency of the gelatinous egg coating vary between different types of salamanders. The spotted salamanders has the most um, the highest consistency. Kind of the egg mass is more looks stronger. It doesn't brittle easily. If you look at Jeffersonian and blue spotted, it's more or less brittly. Now, I want to mention over here is um, look back at the egg mass that is more or less translucent. Now that egg mass, most people first believed it was like a dead egg mass, fungus infected. That's not the case. Now that egg mass comes from a genetically distinct variety of spotted salamanders. Because of their genetic variety, they produce a particular protein that, when it absorbs water, it kind of turns into that coloration because of the hydrophobic properties of the protein that's found within the outer coating of the egg mass. Now, the last image on the lower left, look at the color. That looks green, right? That's because there's an algae, a freshwater algae, developing a symbiotic relationship with spotted salamander embryos. So the spotted salamander embryo, or rather egg mass, provides a habitat for the algae, and the algae photosynthesizes inside the egg mass and shares some of its food with the developing embryo. It's a really interesting relationship, a symbiotic association, mutualistic organization between the spotted salamanders and a freshwater green algae. Now let's talk a lot more about spotted salamanders. Now spotted salamanders are early spring breeders in northeastern United States. They breed sometime around March, April. Um, and their migration also happens, during the same time frame during stormy, wet, rainy nights. Um, they do, like wood frogs, show very high fidelity for their natal ponds. And there are some experiments where people, researchers translocated certain individuals from, their natal pond when they came for breeding to another, and those translocated individuals actually home back to the breeding pond. Pretty interesting. They do also tend to not just revisit the same vernal pool for breeding, but they migrate on exactly the same pathway, following the same direction. Um, Now these guys do not breed every possible season after reproductive maturity. They forgo reproduction just to increase their survival and future reproductive success. They do show some breeding rituals when they reach their breeding vernal pool, as you can see in the lower image. They make something called the congress, where multiple salamanders kind of swim around in circles in the vernal pool. Yeah, egg mass deposition is non-random. They select certain depths, optimal depths for egg reproduction. They usually don't lay eggs in deep water. They always produce eggs in relatively shallow, intermediate water depths, and always they attach their egg masses to standing emergent vegetation or erected vegetation. They don't just drop their egg masses. They always attach their egg masses to some sort of structure. Um, the pool size and number of egg masses now in these spotted salamanders actually show a clear relationship. So you find more egg masses in larger pools. Okay, I'm talking about still vernal pools. So larger vernal pools may have larger number of eggs, and vernal pools with a relatively longer hydro period also tends to have more egg masses. The reason is that ponds with larger hydro periods tends to be larger in size, and also um, spotted salamanders development takes a longer period, starting from March, April, more and all the way going up to July, August. Presence of pH, tannin, and aluminum in these vernal pools may induce um, low embryonic survival and deformity. We don't exactly know how this happens. And the larvae is a predator, right? And they develop within, again, like I mentioned about, um, uh, kind of within a time frame of 6 to 100 days, and in certain cases, all the way up to like 14 months. So pretty interesting to see that they have such a long larval period. Um, and hatching success and larval survival also have very disparate numbers. Very high hatching success, but relatively low larval survival. It's kind of a unique system, the unique thing that you observe in all the pond breeding amphibians. And again, one more thing before I skip the slide. The top image, what you're looking at are spermatophores. Okay, the male sperm packet. There's a lot more that I need to tell you guys about this spotted salamanders. The top image is actually showing another mating ritual, where the male is trying to induce the female into breeding with him. Um, the adult habitats, includes all the forms of forest and woodlands, and sometimes even including open fields. But mostly they occupy forests and woodland habitats. Tends to avoid clear cut area. So clear cutting type of timber management, forest management is quite bad for them. There's a higher level of mortality or avoidance of deforested areas by these salamanders. And also these salamanders move around a lot. So if they were to traverse through altered, developed, built up urban landscapes, they undergo massive amount of stress. That's actually evidently shown by a higher level of corticosteroid hormones found in amistomate salamanders collected from urban, built-up, developed habitats. They are also, travel for greater distances between different types of habitats across the landscape. Therefore, habitat fragmentation could negatively impact the populations. Um, Found, I mentioned, like I mentioned earlier, largely, mostly these guys are found within deciduous forests, um, in vernal pools within deciduous forests, particularly those that are found within well-drained soil with, um, 10% or so slopes, so gentle slopes, in other words, with plenty of leaf litter, coarse woody debris, and large woody debris. And also, these salamanders spend most of their time underground in the subterranean tunnels, so hence they actually like to occupy already existing tunnels, particularly those that were built by shrews. In terms of their breeding related migration, when they migrate back to their breeding sites, they could travel up to, as short as 6 meters to as long as 250 meters just to get to their breeding grounds. In certain studies, these guys have migrated for more than 300 meters. Moving on to another species, the marbled salamander or marble salamander. Now, the term marble comes from that beautiful, black and white contrasting coloration on its body. You can see the distribution is quite wide again in eastern North America, as well as parts of the southern Mississippi Drainage Basin. Um, and certain populations occur at the southernmost border of the Great Lakes area. You do find this species in Massachusetts. Rare, I think it's state listed. Um, and the westernmost edge could go as far as Texas. Um, if you look at the two adults on the top of the slide, the two images on the top, those two salamanders actually have slightly different coloration as well as different color patterns. So that color pattern is kind of a fingerprint for every individual. So kind of works as a mark and recapture technique. If you want to do a population study for these salamanders, all you need to know is identify the unique color pattern and coloration on their body, right? So you take a photograph, that's kind of your marking technique for a mark and recapture type of a population enumeration. On the bottom picture, you are looking at the larval stage, which is 100% aquatic, and the adults are actually more terrestrial than aquatic. Another cool story about these guys, as you can see in the image to the left, like underneath that rock, you are looking at a couple of marble salamanders. And if you zoom a little bit more, you realize it's actually a female or two females guarding their eggs. So this is really typical behavior of the marble salamander. They lay eggs late in the fall or early in the winter underneath rocks, logs, at the edge of the wetlands, or sometimes in the dry wetland vernal pool basin, and she guards the eggs until cold flooding happens, right? So there is some sort of a parental care going on over there. But as soon as the flooding happens, mom leaves the eggs, and eggs may hatch or undergo delayed hatching depending on the temperature. And also in the lower image, you are looking at um, a a marble salamander larvae trying to feed on a spotted salamander egg masses. Now, being since these guys hatch early than any other salamander, than any other amphibian for that matter, they actually act as predators of other amphibians and salamanders. So, presence of ambystomatids, presence of marble salamanders in a vernal pool can actually alter the species composition of other amphibians in that particular habitat. So, the breeding migration of marble salamanders happens, sometimes in certain locations, um, as early as late summer, but in most occasions, during fall. Um, Now, these salamanders, like any other mole salamander or an ambistomatid, they home back for natal ponds along the same route when they are ready to breed, right? And so we know that ambistomatids, small salamanders, have extravagant courtship displays. So these guys have the same too, but they do their courtship display in the dry vernal pool basin. Um, and then females excavate nests under the log or under low leaf litter or under a rock or sometimes in crayfish burrows, right? uh, uh, and then inside those areas they lay their eggs, and also those nests or those egg nests are located in intermediate heights uh, in the vernal pool basin, sometimes at the edge of the vernal pool basin. And um, if the vernal pools are filling during fall rain or early snow melting, those vernal pools tends to result in a greater hatching success of marbled salamanders. Um, Still, eggs can resist drying. So if there's no fall rain, they will survive in the dry basin until the spring rain or spring snow thaw. Um, so I just mentioned that they actually undertake parental care. Um, Embryonic and larval developmental period is highly variable between north and the south. In the south, it's fast. In the north, it takes longer time. Um, and the growth of these salamanders, in general, throughout its distribution, is slower in the early months when there's less food available. But soon after, there is like kind of a hastened rate of development, which also follows the warming trend of the vernal pool, which also follows again the availability of the food. Um, So these guys spend the larvae when they emerge. They spend their most of their time in the pool bottom during the day, or sometimes they hide within the littoral pond vegetation, and then they kind of stratify across the water column during the night. Um, so these guys, since they are the early breeders, they are the first to hatch. They could actually feed on. They could be the predators of other salamanders, other amphibians, and other zooplankton, other invertebrates. The adults largely occupying forest woodland type habitat, sometimes forest edges, and microhabitat wise, other mammalian burrows, so or under the leaf litter, and they do build up home ranges and territories every year, kind of paralleling their reproductive activities. Now let's talk about two more species of mole salamanders: blue spotted salamander on the left, um, Jeffersonian salamander on the right. Now, both of those species occur in northeast, glaciated northeast, including the for blue spotted you find them also around the Great Lakes area. Um, and Jeffersonian's presence in Great Lake areas are relatively limited. But both of these species can be considered as species that are largely distributed within glaciated northeast. Um, Compared to other salamanders, their distribution is relatively restricted, and there is a reason why I am talking about both of these species at the same time, because they do hybridize. Now, these hybrids, the one that you see in the central image is a hybrid. I know that because I know this individual has undergone genetic testing and now we know for sure that it's actually a hybrid. Without genetic testing, you cannot tell whether that is a purebred or a hybrid. In fact, current studies have shown that overwhelmingly these species hybridize more than we historically expected, and that the purebred populations are extremely rare. Now, like I mentioned, compared to embystomatids that we have been talking so far, particularly those you find in the Northeast, these are quite limited in terms of their distribution. Um, they are also explosive breeders, with breeding migration happening in rainy nights in spring. Um, could happen, during the same time or with a slight offset of the spotted salamander reproduction. And the hybrids I just told you about are female biased, meaning hybrids tend to be all female. Meaning when they reproduce, they undergo gynogenesis, where females' eggs um, undergoes embryological division or embryogenesis upon being contacted by a sperm. So the sperm doesn't necessarily penetrate the egg membrane. So the sperm genome doesn't mix with the egg genome. Rather, the egg undergoes embryogenesis upon being in contact by a sperm. Really interesting situation here. Um, Adults are usually found in terms of microhabitats under logs, under rocks, under leaf litter. And although to a certain extent, like any other mole salamander, they use mammalian burrows. Um, they do produce secrete a skin secretion, which is a white colored, creamish, uh, noxious substance. And if threatened, they actually raise their tail and wave it around, kind of spraying the this noxious substance around and kind of lashes it to the potential threat, like a predator. Um, so they do have very interesting courtship displays. During the courtship, the coating they coat by female by nudging her. Let me tell you that the male kind of nudges the female with his snout, and then after that, if she seems to be receptive, the male actually grasps the female behind her front legs and then start rubbing his chin on her head to keep stimulating her. And this is actually kind of a pheromone transfer. This kind of intimate, close physical contact between male and the female, initiated by the male, kind of increases the receptivity of the female to male. It's kind of a very interesting mate selection going on over here. So now, after if the female is receptive, she lays her gelatinous eggs. Well, before she lays her gelatinous eggs, of course, any ambystematic salamander undergoes internal fertilization. If she's receptive, she's going to grab the spermatophore from the coating male, insert it into her reproductive system, and the fertilization happens internally, and then she lays her gelatinous egg as a one single clump, and attach it to sticks, rocks, or other kind of woody debris in the bottom of the breeding pond. Um, and a given clump could contain, up to a dozen eggs, and a given female could lay up to 225 to 300 eggs during a single breeding season. Again, remember, I'm saying 250 to 300 eggs, not egg masses, right? They only lay a much more lower number of egg masses. Just do the math. Divided that number by 12. That's the number of egg masses you get. Um, so larval development could take up to a couple of months, and after hatching, after 2 3 months after hatching, they metamorph into adults, and the timing could be anywhere between June to September, depending when actually the eggs hatch. Do not forget that these guys can delay their hatching, although the eggs were laid, in the during the winter. Um, Now these guys do not overwinter. Okay, so they finish it up within before the need of overwintering, right? So the larvae do not overwinter. Um, Now we are moving to another species, the tiger salamander, right? So the larvae on the right, and you can see those huge external gills, which are characteristic of any amblystomatid salamander, but in this guy is quite unique and and the larva is quite big. And on the left lower side, you see the adult salamander. The larva is aquatic, adult is terrestrial or subterranean, to be a little bit more correct. So there are several subspecies, of the eastern tiger salamander, especially the western and eastern subspecies, right? And then, of course, within the west, you could also identify several type of subspecies, and on the eastern type, you only identify one type of subspecies. So it's a very kind of different differences in the genetic structure in those subspecies. And tiger salamanders are the most widespread salamander species in North America. They spread from southern Canada through the US all the way up to northern Mexico, and they're absent from Great Basin. You don't find them in New England, and they're absent from the Appalachian Mountains. They are introduced to Central California probably through the pet trade. And they do hybridize. The different subpopulations or the subspecies of tiger salamanders hybridize with each other, and they also tend to hybridize with other mole salamanders. Um, there's a plasticity in these life cycles, but given the availability of the food, hydroperiod, and other environmental conditions, um, sometimes certain age classes and cohorts could actually become cannibalistic. Um, they do breed in late winter or in early spring. They have selective oviposition, meaning they don't lay eggs randomly in a given wetland or among wetlands. They are very selective where to oviposite. So most eggs are laid in one or smaller number of ponds, and they hatch fast within a maximum of a month or less. And the adults are usually highly terrestrial, spend most of their time subterranean in burrows. Larvae are predators. Even the non-cannibalistic forms are predators. Um, they undergo metamorphosis around the 10th week after hatching, and however, the metamorphosis could be hydroperiod dependent. Okay, so if the wetland in which they were born to have a longer hydrologic stability, it will take longer, and sometimes certain populations can even overwinter in the pond and transform in the following week. So it's kind of trying to capitalize from the longer availability of water. They try to actually increase their body mass, increase size at metamorphosis, which altogether increase their survival as adults. Yeah, so that's the reason why the time takes to metamorphosis is hydroperiod dependent. In relatively longer hydroperiod ponds, the larvae will grow for a longer period and gain a larger body mass. And when they transform, when they metamorph, the adults will be larger, which are more equipped to disperse better, faster, and survive better. Now we are moving on to newts, right? And we are looking at particularly the eastern red newt. Um, So in the first image, you are looking at an adult. It's an aquatic species. You can see it's underwater. In the other image, you are looking at actually a courtship ritual, right, where the male is wrapping its limbs around the female, and that is an egg mass, right, laid in a fondant. And the larvae develops out of that, which is aquatic, and you can see the external gills, and that is actually a third stage in the life history called an F, which is fully terrestrial, toxic, right? Toxic means like it kind of depending on what they feed on as a larvae, um, it could actually assimilate toxins, um, and make kind of that's an evolutionary wise an anti-predatory strategy, because if a predator eats it, it's toxic, and the predator learns to avoid that kind of animals. So the F migrates over the land for quite a long time until they find a pond, and once they find a pond that is suitable for development of the adulthood, they actually transform into an adult. So larvae, aquatic, adult, aquatic, F, terrestrial. So three major life history stages, right? So a question I always get is, what's the difference between a newt and a salamander? There is none. A newt is a separate family of salamanders. Geographic distribution of these newts are pretty much all over the eastern North America, including certain parts of the Great Lakes and certain parts of the south central as well as the southeastern US. Quite a broad distribution because you can see it goes from the entire southeast all the way to Canada. Mentioned that the adults are largely aquatic, but they sometimes should come to the uplands, particularly if the humidity is quite high or if it is raining, but largely they're aquatic. And then also the bottom image, you are looking at a scene where the larvae as well as adults can actually feed on other eggs, on other larvae. So it's a very voracious predator who can greatly influence the community structure of other amphibians in that particular pond. So yes, like I showed in the image of the map, they're very common throughout the glaciated northeast. Breeding happens in both permanent wetlands as well as in vernal pools. The red F stage that I just mentioned to you, the intermediate stage between larvae and the adults, they could live up to 2 to 7 years. Throughout that years, they are going to be terrestrial. They are going to be on the movement. They will feed. They will keep growing, but they are on the move. So they do feed on the forest floor. They're both diurnal and nocturnal. They can move in both day and night. Could be more active on rainy, humid days and nights than otherwise. And yes, in terms of the forest living strategy, they are predators. And because of their toxicity, they can avoid being predated, so enhances their survival. Um, so I did mention that they breed in both permanent wetlands as well as in vernal pools. But when they breed in temporary wetlands, the adult actually could alternate between their aquatic and terrestrial modes of life. I kind of briefly touched based on that before as well. Um, Adults, can perfectly overwinter on land. So, think about it. If you are living in a temporary wetland, you cannot afford to have a fully aquatic larval stage. So if you cannot afford to have a fully aquatic larval stage, when the pond grows down, you need to have some sort of a mechanism to spend that winter. So hence, those temporary wetland breeding populations will have an adult stage that can live terrestrially and can overwinter on the land. Kind of makes sense if you think about the evolutionary trends over there. Um, so these guys, their breeding period ranges from fall to spring, so kind of a relatively broad breeding season. And the egg laying still mostly happens in the spring. Um, Larval development could be quite variable. So the larval development is variable and usually between 2 to 5 months, meaning the time between um, hatching and transforming into a terrestrial F stage could be between 2 to 5 months. And they could produce a toxic secretions from their skin, from a specialized skin glands embedded in their skin. They can produce a toxic secretion. Um, So these kind of toxic glands are present throughout all the life stages of these species of these newts, but Fs have a greater concentration of this toxic material with a greater toxicity and more higher potency than in other stages. So they also have kind of a warning display. It's known as an Anken reflex. where it closes its eyes and retracts them inward, kind of protect them, and then kind of, making itself into a bow shape, um, where its heads and tail are kind of curved upwards, um, so that the both head and tail kind of meets up. Like kind of imagine doing kind of a yoga pose. And what is the point of this kind of a posture? The reason is when they do that, they actually expose their brightly red colored belly, which kind of helps to deter their predators.